The growl came from nowhere. Not from outside the train. Not from the tracks screaming beneath her. From him. From the shoulder Clara's cheek was resting against. A low vibration under warm cotton. So faint she might have imagined it. Except her body didn't believe that for a second. Every nerve she owned came awake at once. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. That was the joke of it. 41 hours without real rest, and her body had simply mutinied, tipping sideways into the stranger beside her, like it belonged there. She'd told herself 30 seconds, just 30 seconds with her eyes closed, just long enough to stop the tremor in her hands. Her hands. She could feel them now, curled loosely in her lap, unguarded. She never let them go unguarded. The train rattled on through the dark, indifferent. Fluorescent light buzzed overhead, too bright, too clinical for midnight. Somewhere behind her a phone chimed, and went silent. Ordinary sounds. And underneath all of it that growl, low and steady like a warning meant only for her. She should move. Every part of her training screamed it. Sit up, assess, disengage. But her body wouldn't listen. It felt heavy in a way exhaustion alone couldn't explain, pinned by something she didn't have a name for yet. Then the pain arrived. It didn't build. It simply was, white and total, tearing through her shoulder like something had reached inside her and lit a match. Clara's eyes flew open on a scream she'd barely recognized as her own. Raw and short, swallowed almost instantly by her own hand clamped over her mouth. Old habits. Even in agony, some reflex older than fear told her, don't be loud. Don't be seen. Too late for that. The stranger's mouth was still at her shoulder. She felt him pull back, felt cool air rush against skin that throbbed like it had been branded. Her vision swam, edges silvering, and for one disoriented second she thought, absurdly, of a struck match cooling in the dark. She turned her head, slow, because turning it fast made the world tilt, and looked at him properly for the first time. He was watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with an apology. Broad through the shoulders in a way that filled the narrow train seat. Dark hair damp at the temple, like he'd been running before he ever sat down beside her. His jaw was tight, his breathing controlled in a way that told her he was working very hard to look calm. His eyes, pale, gold-flecked, entirely too alert for midnight. Tracked her face like he was cataloging every flicker of her expression. Not predator cruel, something worse. Focused. What? Clara said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Did you just do to me? He didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped once to her shoulder, to whatever was there now, hot and aching under her collar, and something crossed his face too fast for her to name. Not quite regret either. You fell asleep on me, he said finally. Low voice, controlled, rasping at the edges like he was holding something back with it. That's all you did wrong. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. The train rocked through a curve, throwing her shoulder briefly against the window, and the pain flared bright enough that she bit down on a second sound. Around them, further down the car, she registered movement. Bodies shifting, heads turning with an alertness that had nothing to do with a woman's stifled cry. Too many people, waking up too fast, too aware. Her instincts, the ones that had kept her alive for a decade of quiet, terrible work, went off like a siren behind her ribs. She was not alone with one dangerous stranger. She was surrounded. Clara did the math before she'd even finished exhaling. 6 other passengers in the train car, 2 by the far door, both suddenly, unnaturally still. 1 woman 2 rows up whose head had turned exactly 40 degrees toward Clara and stayed there, unblinking. A man near the emergency exit whose posture had gone from slouched to coiled in a space of 1 heartbeat. Not commuters, not anymore, if they'd ever been. She kept her face blank, that at least her body still knew how to do. The mask sliding into place over rising panic like a well-oiled door. Assess. Don't react. Find the exit before you need it. You're not human, she said quietly, to the man beside her, because he was the only one close enough to answer, and the only one who'd started this. No. No hesitation in it, no shame either. And whatever you just did to me. A claim. He said it the way other men might say a fact about the weather, except his jaw ticked once when the word left him, like it cost him more than he wanted her to see. A bite. It's permanent. The word landed in her chest like a drop of stone. Permanent. Clara had built her entire life around one operating principle. Nothing was permanent unless you let it be. Names could be shed. Faces could be rearranged with enough patience and the right kind of makeup. Debts could be buried under new debts until the trail went cold. Permanent was a word for people who hadn't learned yet how to disappear. Undo it, she said. Something flickered across his face. Not amusement, nothing so simple. Closer to grief. I can't. Then whoever can. There isn't anyone. His eyes hadn't left hers once, gold-flecked and unbearably steady, like he was trying to anchor her in place through all contact alone. I'm sorry. I wasn't looking for this, but it's done. She wanted to laugh, wanted to scream. Neither reaction would get her off this train alive, so she did neither, and instead let her mind do what it did best. Narrow, sharpen, calculate. Exits, too, both currently blocked by bodies that weren't human either. Weapon. The small blade in her boot. Useless against 6 against 1, especially 6 that could apparently smell fear through fabric. Cover story. Currently on fire. If these people had any way of checking her name against anything real. Who are you? She said. Not a question anymore. A demand. Kael. A beat. You're on my territory. Has been since the last stop. Territory. Not city, not neighborhood. Territory. Like she'd wandered onto the wrong side of an invisible line and paid for it with her own skin. And you bite everyone who trespasses? For the first time, something almost like humor moved behind his eyes, gone as fast as it came. No, he said. Just you. The train began to slow, not a scheduled stop. She'd have known. She always knew. But the couplings groaned, and the platform lights outside the windows started sliding past too fast to be anything but deliberate. Someone up front was making a choice for all of them. Clara's pulse spiked, sharp and cold. Where are we stopping? Kael's hand found her wrist. Not cruel, not even tight exactly, just absolute, like a door closing on a room she hadn't finished searching. Somewhere we can talk, he said, without an audience. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up at his face, memorizing the exact geography of his features the way she memorized every threat that mattered. I don't do talks I can't walk away from, she said. His grip didn't loosen. You're not going anywhere. Later, much later, when none of this made sense anymore. Clara would think back to the week before the train and understand that she'd already been drowning long before Kael ever touched her. It had started with a phone call at 3 a.m., her brother's voice thin and wrecked on the other end. I made a mistake, Clara. A bad one. They're going to kill me. And underneath the fear in his voice, something worse. The particular shame of a man who already knew he deserved it. He'd skimmed money from the wrong people. Not much, by the numbers. Enough, by the rules that governed men who didn't forgive mistakes. The syndicate didn't do second chances. They did examples. She remembered sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark. Phone pressed so hard to her ear, it left a mark. Doing what she always did when the world tilted. Building a plan out of nothing. A ledger here. A dummy account there. A cover identity dusted off and slotted back into place, like a coat she'd never really taken off. I'll fix it, she told him. I always fix it. That was the shape of her whole life, if anyone had bothered to ask. Fixing. Disappearing. Making herself small enough and quiet enough that nothing could ever get a grip on her, because a grip was how you got hurt. Her handlers had taught her that a long time ago, back when she was young enough to still believe love came without conditions attached. It didn't. Not in her world. Love was leverage wearing a softer face, and the sooner you learned to need no one, the sooner you stopped being anyone's weakness. She'd built a decade of quiet competence on that lesson. No real friends, no real home, a string of names that weren't hers, worn and shed like snakeskin, until even she sometimes had to pause and remember which one she was supposed to be answering to. And it had worked. That was the terrible private irony of it. It had worked, right up until the night she let her guard down for 30 seconds, on a train, and a stranger's teeth changed everything. Her phone buzzed against her hip, cutting through the memory like a blade. A number she recognized, a handler, checking in, the message clipped and businesslike as always. Status? Clara's thumb hovered over the screen. Her shoulder throbbed under her collar. A foreign brand searing into skin that had never belonged to anyone but her. Two masters now, she thought distantly. The syndicate who would kill her brother without blinking, and whatever Kael was, whatever that bite had made her, who apparently thought permanent was an acceptable answer to give a stranger on a train. She typed back 3 words. On schedule. Confirming. A lie. She had no schedule left. She had no idea anymore what her life was going to look like past the next hour. She slid the phone back into her pocket and looked up to find Kael watching her from across the narrow aisle. Patient, in a way that felt more dangerous than threats would have, waiting for her to finish whatever war she was fighting behind her eyes. Two masters, she thought again, both of them capable of destroying what little was left of her. She had exactly no idea yet which one was going to break her first. The car outside the station was black, low, and expensive in the understated way that meant someone never had to check a price tag in their life. Kael held the door for her, not a gesture, an expectation, and Clara climbed in because 6 unnaturally calm strangers on a train platform had made the alternative very clear. The door shut with a solid final thunk. Inside, the city smeared past the tinted windows, streetlights bleeding gold across the leather seats. Kael sat across from her, not beside her this time, giving her space she hadn't asked for and didn't entirely trust. The silence between them stretched, thick enough to touch. She used it to look at him properly, really look, the way she'd trained herself to look at every threat that mattered. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe early 30s, though something about his eyes carried more weight than that. His suit was tailored, dark, the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. His hands rested on his knees, loosely, deliberately loose, like a man reminding himself not to clench his fists. Every line of him said controlled, but underneath the control, something coiled and waiting, the way a held breath waits to be let out. "You're going to tell me what happens now," Clara said. Not a question. She'd learned a long time ago that questions gave people room to lie. Statements didn't. "I don't know yet," Kael said. "Not good enough. It's the truth." His jaw tightened, just slightly, the only crack in the composure. "This doesn't happen. Not like this. Not to strangers on a train." "So I'm an accident?" "You're not an accident." Something sharpened in his voice, fast and low, gone again just as quick. "I don't know what you are yet. That's the problem." Clara filed that away, the flicker of frustration, the way his gaze kept dropping to her shoulder and away again like the sight of the mark itself unsettled him. He wasn't lying to her. She was good enough at her job to know the difference between a controlled man and a dishonest one, and whatever Kael was doing right now, it wasn't performance. That should have made her feel safer. It didn't. "What do you want from me?" she said. "Right now?" His eyes met hers, steady, unreadable in the low light. "Time, to understand what this is before either of us does something we can't undo." "I have a life," Clara said. The words came out sharper than she meant, edged with something close to desperation. "People who need me. I can't just—" "I know." He said it quietly, not dismissive, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than if he'd been cruel. "I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to stay somewhere I can keep you safe while we figure out what this bond actually means." Safe. The word landed strange in her ears, foreign, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. Nobody had offered her safety in longer than she could remember. Safety was a thing she built for other people, brick by careful brick, never for herself. The car slowed, turning through a gate that rose without a visible hand to open it, into grounds she couldn't yet see the edges of. Clara looked out at the dark sweep of it, jaw tight, mind already running through exits that didn't exist yet. She should have known, she thought, that closing her eyes on a midnight train would cost her more than a few hours of rest. She just hadn't known, until this exact moment, that it might cost her everything she'd spent her whole life learning how to protect. The gate closed behind the car, with a sound like a held breath being let out. Clara watched it happen in the side mirror. Iron folding shut, over the only way out she'd seen so far, and made herself memorize the shape of it anyway. 2 hinges, a keypad glowing faint blue in the dark. Filed away, useless probably, but hers. The car rolled to a stop in front of a house that wasn't a house so much as a statement. Stone and glass and old money, lit from within like it had never once worried about who was watching. Kael didn't wait for a driver to open his door. He opened hers instead, offering a hand she didn't take, and led her up a wide stone step, into a front hall that smelled of cedar and something colder underneath it. Something that made the hair on her arms rise before she understood why. Wolves. Actual wolves somewhere close. Their scent worked into the walls, like it had soaked in over years. "This way," Kael said, and didn't look back to see if she followed. He didn't have to. She followed because there was nowhere else to go, and because some small treacherous part of her wanted to see how this played out. He led her into a study lined with books that looked read, rather than decorative, and gestured her toward a chair she didn't sit in. Instead, she stood by the window, arms crossed, watching him move to a desk and wake a sleek black laptop with 2 efficient taps. "What are you doing?" she said. "Finding out who you are." No apology in it. Just fact, delivered the way he seemed to deliver everything. Flat, certain, immovable. Her pulse spiked. She kept her face still. "You could just ask." "I am asking." His eyes flicked up to hers, gold-flecked and patient. "You haven't answered anything yet. Not your name. Not why you smelled like fear and gunmetal before I ever touched you." She hadn't known that was something he could smell. She filed it away with everything else. One more variable in a game she was rapidly losing the shape of. "Clara," she said finally, because a name at least cost her nothing that mattered. It wasn't the one on file. It wasn't the one that mattered. He typed it in, waited. The soft click of keys was the only sound in the room, and Clara used the silence to run the numbers on how thin her cover actually was. 3 names deep, most of it clean, built over years by people who understood that survival meant never leaving a single thread someone could pull. 90 seconds, she thought, maybe less, before whatever database he had access to came back with something close enough to true to matter. The screen's glow lit the underside of his face, and she watched something flicker there, the faintest crease between his brows, the kind that meant results, not confusion. Her stomach dropped. "That's strange," he said, quiet. "What is?" Nothing comes up, weighing her, in a way that made her skin prickle. "A woman who doesn't exist, on a train that runs through my territory, at exactly the hour it does. That's not luck." Her mind raced through explanations, discarded 3 before they finished forming. Anything too smooth would confirm his suspicion faster than silence would. "Maybe your database is outdated," she said. "Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. He closed the laptop instead, slow and deliberate, like a man setting down a weapon he intended to pick back up later. "Or maybe you're better at disappearing than most people I've met." The words landed too close to true. Clara held his gaze and said nothing, because nothing was the only answer that couldn't be used against her. Kael studied her a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "We'll talk again in the morning," he said finally. "Someone will show you to a room." It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a threat either. It was simply the sound of a door closing somewhere she couldn't yet see, and Clara understood, with cold clarity, that her 90 seconds of grace had just run out. The room they gave her had a lock on the outside. Clara noticed it the way she noticed everything, instantly and without comment, while a silent woman with sharp eyes showed her where the bathroom was, and left a folded set of clothes on the bed, like this was a hotel, and not whatever this actually was. The door clicked shut. Clara didn't test the handle. She already knew. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself finally feel the shake in her hands. It lasted 4 seconds. She counted them, the way she counted everything that threatened to become a problem, and then she made it stop. Because shaking hands didn't fix anything, and there wasn't time. Her phone buzzed against her thigh. She already knew who it would be before she looked. The message sat there in stark, businesslike font, the kind that made her stomach fold in on itself every time. "Handler. Status update required. Package secure?" Her brother. Always the package. Never a name, never a person, because names were liabilities, and her handlers had trained that lesson into her before she was old enough to argue. She typed back with hands that had finally stopped trembling. "Complication. Need 48 hours. The reply came fast enough that she knew someone had been sitting on the other end, waiting for exactly this kind of failure. "Handler, you don't have 48 hours. Package's situation deteriorating. Deliver by end of week, or the arrangement is void." Void. A word with no softness in it at all. Void meant her brother's protection evaporated. Void meant the syndicate stopped waiting and started making examples again, the way they'd promised, the way they always did. Clara set the phone down on the bed like it had grown too heavy to hold, and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She had 2 choices, and neither of them were good. Comply, extract whatever intelligence the syndicate wanted from inside this compound, betray a man who'd done nothing yet but claim her without asking, and lock her in a gilded room. Or refuse, and watch her brother pay for a debt that had never really been his to owe in the first place. Their parents had made sure of that a long time ago, teaching both of them that survival came before conscience, and love always, eventually, came with a price tag attached. She thought of her brother's voice on that first call. "They're going to kill me, Clara." Not a threat, a certainty. There was a third option technically. Tell Kael everything, and hope his protection extended further than his territory. But she'd known this man for exactly 3 hours, most of which he'd spent locking doors around her, and trust wasn't a currency she had left to spend on strangers with claiming teeth and gold-flecked eyes. She opened her contact list instead, the burner she used only for this, the one piece of leverage she still had outside the syndicate's reach, and started composing a message she knew, even as she typed it, might be the thing that finally burned everything down. Halfway through the second line, she deleted it. Started again. Deleted that too. Her hands were steady now. That frightened her more than the shaking had. Finally she wrote 3 words, clean and final, and hit send before she could think better of it. Handling it. Wait. Then she deleted the entire thread, every message, every trace, every fingerprint of the woman she'd been 3 hours ago, and sat in the sudden silence of a locked room, listening to her own heartbeat slow, one careful breath at a time. Somewhere down the hall, she heard footsteps stop outside her door. Not entering, just stopping, listening maybe, the way she would have listened if their positions were reversed. She didn't move. She'd learned a long time ago that stillness was its own kind of answer. Morning arrived, without her sleeping through any of it. Clara had spent the hours cataloging instead. The creak of the 3rd floorboard from the left, the 2-minute gap in the patrol pattern outside her window, the particular quality of silence that fell over the compound sometime after 2 a.m. and lifted again just before dawn. It was instinct as much as strategy. A mind that had learned long ago that information was the only currency that never devalued. When the door finally opened, it wasn't the sharp-eyed woman from the night before. It was Kael, dressed plainer than yesterday, his sleeves pushed back to his forearms in a way that made the sheer size of him harder to ignore. "You're awake," he said, not a question. "I don't sleep well in cages." She let the words sit there, deliberate, watching to see if it landed. Something flickered across his jaw. "It's not a cage. The lock's on the outside." He didn't argue that. Instead he studied her, the same weighing look from the study the night before, like he was still trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. "Come with me," he said finally. "You should see where you're staying. All of it. Not just a locked door." She followed, because refusing accomplished nothing, and information was worth more than pride. The compound sprawled further than the house alone suggested, training yards where men and women moved through drills with an efficiency that had nothing to do with sport. A low building she clocked immediately as some kind of armory. Guards posted with the loose, coiled readiness of people who fought real battles rather than drilled for imaginary ones. Clara cataloged exits without meaning to. Old habits didn't announce themselves. They simply ran, quiet and constant, underneath everything else she did. A man fell into step beside them near the second courtyard. Smiling, easy, dressed with a casual confidence that read as deliberate rather than natural. His eyes found her immediately, lingered a half-second too long on her collar, where the mark still ached beneath fabric. "Well," he said, voice pleasant in a way that set every instinct in her on edge at once. "So this is her." "Marcus," Kael said, and something in his tone tightened, brief and controlled. "This is Clara." "Clara." Marcus tried the name out like he was testing whether it fit. "You're a long way from wherever you actually came from." It wasn't a question. She recognized the shape of it immediately. A probe, dressed up as small talk, testing for a crack. She'd built a career reading exactly this kind of opening. "So are you," she said, mild, giving him nothing back. Marcus's smile widened, sharp at the edges, and for one unguarded second, something moved behind his eyes that had nothing to do with friendliness at all. Smoothed back over so fast, she might have imagined it if she hadn't spent a decade learning to trust exactly these kinds of flickers. "I like her," Marcus said to Kael, like she wasn't standing right there. She's got teeth. She's got somewhere to be, Kael said, and the words came out flat enough to end the conversation. Marcus inclined his head, easy as ever, and peeled off toward the training yard without another word. Clara watched him go, cataloging the set of his shoulders, the too relaxed sway of his walk, filing him under a heading she reserved for very few people. Dangerous, and enjoying it. Who was that? She said, though some cold, professional part of her already suspected the answer mattered more than Kael was going to say out loud. My beta. Kael's jaw was tight, his eyes still on the spot where Marcus had disappeared. Stay away from him. Why? He didn't answer right away, and when he finally did, his voice had dropped into something low and careful, like he was choosing each word for weight rather than speed. Because I don't trust him, he said, and I've learned the hard way to trust that instinct. By the time Kael led her back inside, the sun had climbed high enough to burn the last of the compound's night chill out of the air. And Clara's mind had not stopped working the entire walk back. Marcus, the flicker behind his eyes, Kael's flat immovable stay away from him, none of it fit together cleanly yet, but she'd learned to trust the itch of an unfinished pattern more than she trusted most people's explanations, and every part of her was itching. You said this wasn't a cage, she said, once they were alone again in the hallway outside her room. Prove it. Kael stopped walking, turned to face her fully for the first time since the study, and for a moment the careful control in his expression cracked just enough to let something rawer show through. Frustration, maybe, or something closer to helplessness, an expression that didn't sit naturally on a man built like he was. I can't let you leave, he said. Not yet. Not until I understand what this bond means, and not while I don't know who you really are. That's not proof. That's a cage with better lighting. It's the truth. His voice had gone low, rasping faintly at the edges, the way it had on the train, like honesty cost him something he wasn't used to spending. I didn't ask for this either. I don't know what I did to you on that train, any more than you do. But I know what happens if I let you walk out that gate before we understand it. You'd be a stranger to my pack, unclaimed and unexplained, and there are people here who'd see that as a weakness worth exploiting. Marcus, she thought immediately, though she didn't say the name out loud. So I'm a hostage for my own protection, she said instead. That's convenient. You're not a hostage. Something sharpened in his voice, fast and low. He stopped, started again more careful. I don't have a word for what you are yet. That's the problem. I've never had this happen before, not to me, not to anyone I know. Clara studied him, the tight set of his shoulders, the way his hands had curled slightly at his sides like he was resisting the urge to reach for her, and didn't fully trust himself not to. Whatever this was costing him, it wasn't nothing. She thought of the message still sitting unanswered on her phone. You don't have 48 hours. She thought of her brother, and the syndicate, and the third option she hadn't been brave enough to take yet. Telling this man, this stranger with claiming teeth and an unreadable jaw, exactly what kind of trouble had followed her onto that train in the first place. She didn't take it. Not yet. The words sat locked behind her teeth, held there by 10 years of training that told her trust was the fastest way to get someone killed. I need to know one thing, she said instead. If I give you my word I won't run, will you take the lock off my door? Something in his expression shifted. Surprised. Like he hadn't expected her to offer anything at all. Would your word mean something? It would be the first true thing I've told you, she said, and watched him weigh that. Weigh her. The same careful calculation she'd been running on him since the moment his teeth broke her skin. Then yes, Kael said finally. I'll take it off. It wasn't safety. It wasn't trust. Not really, not yet. But it was a door that would open from both sides now, and for a woman who'd spent her whole life mapping exits before anything else, that felt for one unguarded moment dangerously close to being seen. She should have known, she thought again, watching him walk away down the hall, that closing her eyes on a midnight train would cost her more than her freedom. It was starting, slowly and against every instinct she owned, to cost her the wall she'd built around everything else too. The lock was gone by morning. Clara noticed it the way she noticed everything. A glance at the doorframe on her way past, the faint pale mark where hardware had been unscrewed and not replaced. She didn't test it. She didn't need to. A promise kept, even a small one, was data, and data was the only thing she trusted completely. She spent the day the way she'd have spent any first day inside a target's perimeter, if this had been a job instead of whatever it actually was. Walking corridors like she had somewhere to be. Watching who deferred to whom without being told to. Learning which guards rotated on the hour and which drifted 5 minutes late every time, like clockwork you could set a plan by. By evening she had the shape of it. Kael sat at the top, obviously, but the compound ran on a web of quieter loyalties beneath him. A woman named Priya who managed supply logistics with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd rather be respected than liked. A pair of enforcers who took orders from Marcus faster than they took them from anyone else. A scattering of pack members whose eyes tracked Clara everywhere she went, curious and wary in equal measure. She found herself, without entirely meaning to, building a second ledger. The first had always been the syndicates, profit and loss, leverage and threat, the cold architecture of men who mistook fear for loyalty. This one was different. This one mapped Kael's empire instead. Supply routes, treaty language half overheard through an open door. The names of pack elders who nodded to him with real respect instead of the careful performative kind. She told herself she was building it for her handler. Some quieter, more honest part of her didn't quite believe that anymore. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor of her room that evening, notebook balanced on her knee, sketching the shape of a supply chain she had no business caring about, when she caught herself humming. She stopped instantly, pen frozen mid-line. It wasn't a song she recognized, just some tuneless thread of sound that had slipped out of her without permission. The kind of unguarded noise she hadn't made since she was young enough to still believe the world was safe. She sat very still afterward, listening to the silence where the humming had been, and felt something close to panic that had nothing to do with syndicates or claiming bites at all. She had not been unguarded like that in 10 years, not once, not by accident. Her hand went, unthinking, to the mark at her shoulder, still faintly warm beneath her collar. She didn't understand what it was doing to her, only that it seemed to be working loose stitches she'd sewn shut a very long time ago, one careless thread at a time. Downstairs, faint through the floorboards, she heard Kael's voice, low, controlled, issuing some instruction to someone she couldn't identify. She found herself listening for it, the way she'd have listened for a threat, except it didn't sit in her chest like a threat did. It sat somewhere else entirely, somewhere she didn't have a defense built for yet. Clara closed the notebook, set it aside, and made herself a promise instead. The kind she still, for now, believed she could keep. Whatever this compound was doing to her, whatever the bond was quietly unraveling in her chest, she would not let it slow her hands or dull her instincts. She had a brother to save. Everything else was noise. The argument started over a man named Torin. Clara found him waiting outside her door the next morning, broad, silent, positioned with the deliberate stillness of someone who'd been ordered to stand exactly there and not move. She recognized the type immediately. A handler's shadow. A leash dressed up as courtesy. "No," she said, before he'd even finished introducing himself. "Kael's orders," Torin said, unbothered, like refusal was a formality he'd already priced in. She found Kael in the study 20 minutes later, arms braced against the desk, the picture of a man who'd expected exactly this conversation and hadn't looked forward to it. "You assigned me a babysitter," she said. "I assigned you protection. I've evaded professional surveillance teams for a living." The words came out sharp, faster than she'd planned, years of restraint fraying at the edges. "I don't need a man twice my size following me to the bathroom." "This isn't the same as evading a surveillance team." His voice stayed level, which somehow made it worse. "This is my territory, my rules. If something happens to you here, it happens on my watch, and I'm not willing to." "Willing to what?" She cut him off, stepping closer despite every instinct telling her not to close the distance. "Own me? Control me the way you control everything else in this compound?" Something flickered hard behind his eyes. "That's not what this is. Isn't it?" "No." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the careful composure cracked into something rawer, faster, words coming quick and low with none of his usual measured weight. "You don't understand what it means, having something marked as mine, walking around unguarded. It's not about control. It's about what happens to you if, Marcus." He stopped himself. Too late. She'd already caught the name. "Marcus," she repeated, flat. "You think Marcus would hurt me?" "I think," Kael said, each word deliberate now, reined back in, that I don't know what Marcus would do, and I'd rather never find out. The silence after that sat heavy between them, charged with things neither of them was saying outright. Clara studied his face, the tension along his jaw, the way his hands had gone rigid at his sides, gripping the edge of the desk like it was the only thing keeping them where they belonged. I don't need a guard, she said finally, quieter now. I need you to trust that I can handle myself. That's the only protection that's ever actually worked for me. Kael didn't answer right away. When he did, something in his voice had shifted, worn down at the edges. Fine. No guard. A beat. But you tell me if you see him near you. Anywhere. Anytime. That I can agree to. He nodded once, sharp, and looked away first, which she noted, filed away, because in every negotiation she'd ever run, whoever looked away first was the one who'd given more ground than they meant to. She recognized the shape of victory clearly enough. And yet walking back to her room afterward, she couldn't shake the uncomfortable, unfamiliar suspicion that he'd let her win it. Not out of weakness, but because some part of him had wanted her to have exactly this, the freedom to prove herself, instead of being kept safe by force. She hated that she'd noticed. She hated more that it made something in her chest go warm and unguarded. The same treacherous warmth from the humming the night before, spreading further now, harder to contain. She found the discrepancy by accident, or near enough to accident that it still surprised her. Priya had left a set of ledgers open on a side table in the east wing, the kind of oversight that told Clara this compound hadn't yet learned to guard its paperwork the way it guarded its people. She wasn't supposed to be in that hallway. She told herself she was simply passing through, and didn't entirely believe it, even as she slowed her steps and let her eyes drop to the pages. Shipment manifests. Routine at first glance. Feedstock, medical supplies, the unglamorous machinery that kept a pack this size running. But 3 lines down, a number didn't match. A payment routed through an account she didn't recognize, split into amounts too precise to be careless, too small individually to trigger anyone's notice. Her pulse picked up, quiet and professional. She'd seen structuring like this before, not from pack logistics, from the syndicate. The exact fingerprint of money being moved in a way designed to stay beneath every threshold that might flag it. Someone here understood laundering technique at a level that had no business belonging to a wolf pack's supply chain. She memorized the account number before she made herself walk on, unhurried, like she'd seen nothing worth remembering at all. That evening she tested the thread carefully, mentioning the shipment in passing to Kael over a meal neither of them had touched much of. Your feed costs jumped last quarter, she said, light, watching his face rather than his words. Almost 12%. Seems steep for routine restocking. Kael's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. It shouldn't have, he said slowly. I approved the original contract, not a renegotiation. Someone renegotiated it without telling you. His jaw tightened, and this time the anger that moved through him wasn't controlled at all. A flash of something dangerous, quickly reined back in, but not quickly enough to hide from her. Not anger at her. Anger at the information itself, the shape of a betrayal he hadn't seen coming. Who told you about the shipment? He said. I saw the ledger. I wasn't looking for it. True enough, mostly. I used to do work that involved reading numbers other people didn't want read. I noticed the pattern before I noticed I was noticing it. He studied her for a long moment, something recalculating behind his eyes. Not suspicion exactly, closer to a man quietly redrawing a map he'd trusted for years and finding a hole in it he hadn't expected. I'll look into it, he said finally, low. You should look into who has authority to renegotiate supply contracts without your sign-off. She kept her voice even, professional, the voice she used when she wanted information to land without triggering defensiveness. That's a narrow list usually. Something shifted behind his expression, and she watched him arrive, slow and reluctant, at a thought he clearly didn't want to have. He didn't say the name. Neither did she. But she saw it land anyway, saw the muscle along his jaw tighten in a way that told her exactly who he was thinking of. And for one unguarded moment, they sat in silence together, 2 people quietly circling the same unspoken shape. Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, unhurried, familiar, closer than either of them had noticed. Marcus's voice drifted through the open door before he did. Easy and pleasant as always. Reading anything interesting? He asked, sliding into the doorway with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, gaze flicking briefly, deliberately, to the ledger still half visible on the table between them. Marcus didn't stay long. He never did. Just long enough to leave a question hanging in the air and watch it unsettle whoever he'd aimed it at, then drift off again with that same unhurried, untouchable ease. Clara watched him go, and felt the hair on her arms rise the way it had the very first time she'd seen him, an instinct she was starting to trust more than she trusted most people's words. Kael waited until his footsteps faded before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had dropped into something quieter than she'd heard from him yet. "Walk with me," he said. She almost said no. Old habits didn't die easily, and every part of her still ran the calculation on every request, searching for the hook hidden inside it. But something in his face, tired, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen since the study that first night, made her fall into step beside him instead. They ended up on a stone terrace at the back of the house, overlooking grounds that fell away into dark tree line, the compound's lights glowing faint and distant behind them. The air smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet, cool and heavy, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. "You didn't have to tell me about the ledger," Kael said finally. "No. Why did you?" She considered lying. It would have been easy and safer, and every instinct she'd built over a decade told her that safety and honesty rarely lived in the same sentence. But something about the stillness of the night, the way his shoulders had finally visibly loosened for the first time since she'd met him, made the lie feel smaller than the truth wanted to be. "Because it mattered," she said instead. "And because I'm tired of only ever using what I know to protect myself." Kael turned to look at her properly, and in the low light his eyes had lost some of their usual careful control. Something raw underneath. Something that looked almost like disbelief that she'd said it out loud at all. "You don't strike me as someone who lets herself be tired," he said. "I'm not, usually." A breath. "You're making that harder than it used to be." He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them, long enough that she could hear her own pulse in it, and when he finally spoke his voice had gone low and rough at the edges, like he was choosing every word with more care than the moment probably required. "I don't know what to do with you," he admitted. "I've led this pack for 6 years. I don't second-guess decisions. I don't lie awake wondering if I've read someone wrong." A pause, heavier than the ones before it. "You've made me do both, and I've known you 4 days. Something in her chest, already worn thin by the humming, the terrace, the quiet unraveling that had been happening since the moment his teeth found her shoulder, gave way completely. She didn't move closer. She didn't need to. The space between them had already narrowed to something that felt less like distance and more like restraint. Both of them standing very still, very careful, on the edge of something neither of them had agreed to yet. "I should go inside," she said, and didn't move. "You should," Kael agreed, and didn't move either. Neither of them did for a long moment that felt far longer than it actually was, until their phone buzzed in her pocket, sharp and sudden, shattering the stillness like glass. She pulled it out with hands that had gone unsteady again, and read the message twice before the words fully landed. "Handler, 3 days, no extensions, deliver, or the arrangement's void, and so is your brother's protection." Clara stared at the screen until the letters blurred, the warmth of the terrace, of Kael's quiet honesty, of the unguarded moment they'd just shared, draining out of her all at once. 3 days. She looked up to find Kael watching her, his expression already sharpening with concern he hadn't earned an explanation for yet, and understood, with cold and sudden clarity, that whatever she'd started letting herself feel on this terrace, she didn't have the luxury of finishing it. Not yet. She didn't sleep. She hadn't expected to. 3 days sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't put down, and by the time the compound stirred awake around her, Clara had already run through every version of the plan she could build, and discarded most of them as either too slow or too likely to get someone killed. She was standing in the east corridor, half-formed strategy still turning behind her eyes, when Marcus stepped out of the side room, directly into her path. "Clara." He said her name like he was tasting it, unhurried, blocking just enough of the corridor that walking past him would have meant walking through him. "Just the woman I wanted to see." "I doubt that." She kept her voice flat, gave him nothing to work with. "You'd be surprised." His smile widened, easy and warm on the surface, wrong underneath it in a way she'd catalogued from the very first day. "I hear you've been busy. Ledgers, shipment routes, You've got quite the eye for numbers, for someone who doesn't officially exist anywhere. Her pulse spiked, controlled, invisible. I don't know what you mean. Sure you do. He stepped half a pace closer, casual, the kind of closeness that wasn't quite a threat, and wasn't quite not one either. You're careful. I respect that. Careful people usually have something worth being careful about. A pause, deliberate, time to land exactly where it hurt. How's your brother doing, by the way? Rough business. What he got himself into. The world narrowed to a single point of cold, total focus. She didn't let her face move, didn't let her breath catch, didn't let a single muscle in her body confirm what he'd just handed her. Proof that he knew. Proof that whatever this man was, he had reached far beyond this compound, far enough to touch the one thing she'd spent her entire life protecting. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, and was almost proud of how steady it came out. No, Marcus agreed, pleasant as ever. I don't imagine you do. His eyes held hers a beat too long, something sharp and knowing glittering behind the friendliness. Here's a thought, though. Kael doesn't need to know everything, does he? Some things are easier handled quietly, between people who understand each other. I don't understand you at all. You will. He straightened, smiles softening back into something almost warm, almost forgettable, and stepped aside to let her pass, like the entire exchange had been nothing more than idle small talk. Have a good morning, Clara. She walked past him without another word, spine straight, pace even, every trained instinct in her body screaming to run, and every ounce of discipline she owned, refusing to let her legs listen. It wasn't until she'd turned 2 full corners and shut herself inside an empty stairwell that she let herself stop, back pressed to cold stone, breath finally coming ragged and fast. He knew about her brother. Not guessed, knew, with the specific, casual confidence of a man who'd done the digging himself or had someone do it for him. Which meant the syndicate wasn't just watching her from a distance anymore. It meant they were already inside these walls. She found Kael in the study an hour later, and this time she was the one who started the conversation. The shipment discrepancy, she said, before he'd even looked up from the papers spread across his desk. Have you found who authorized it? Something in his expression sharpened immediately, alert in the way of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this update and hadn't liked what he'd found so far. Not yet. Whoever did it covered their tracks well, better than pack business usually requires. That's not surprising. She kept her voice level, professional, the tone she used when she needed information to land clean without triggering defensiveness. It has the fingerprint of someone who's moved money for people with real reasons to hide it. Structured payments. A mouth split to stay under every reporting threshold. That's not amateur work. Kael's jaw tightened, slow and total, the same barely restrained anger she'd seen flicker in him once before over the same subject. You're saying someone in my pack has done this kind of thing professionally? I'm saying whoever renegotiated that contract didn't learn structuring from a supply chain seminar. He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched the muscles along his jaw work, watched him arrive, reluctantly, at a conclusion he'd clearly been circling for days and refusing to land on outright. Marcus, he said finally, low, like the name cost him something to say. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. His eyes lifted to hers, sharp now, focused in a way that made her spine go straight on instinct. You've been circling around his name since the ledger. I'm not blind, Clara. I've just been hoping I was wrong. She thought of the corridor that morning, Marcus's easy smile, the casual, devastating mention of her brother, the quiet promise wrapped inside pleasantries. Every professional instinct told her to hold that back, to keep her evidence compartmentalized until she had proof solid enough to move on. But something else, something newer and less disciplined, wanted badly to warn him. I'm not accusing anyone of anything I can't prove, she said instead, careful. But if I were running an operation like this, and I wanted to move money without my alpha noticing, I'd want exactly the kind of access your beta has, trusted enough not to be questioned, central enough to touch everything. Kael's hands flattened against the desk, knuckles paling with the pressure. He's been my beta for 6 years. Before that, he saved my life twice. His voice had dropped into something low and rough, not directed at her exactly, more like a man arguing with a version of himself that didn't want this to be true. If you're right about this, I might not be. But if you are? He looked up, and the anger in his eyes had gone cold now, controlled, dangerous in a way she hadn't seen from him yet. That's not just a betrayal of the pack's finances, That's a betrayal of everything I thought I understood about the people closest to me. Clara said nothing, watching him absorb it, watching the recalibration happen in real time, a man redrawing the map of who he trusted, one careful, painful line at a time. She recognized the process. She'd lived inside it for most of her adult life. "I'll dig deeper," he said finally, voice steadying back into command. Quietly, "If he suspects we're onto him before I have proof, it could go badly. For the pack, for you." The warning in that last part landed harder than she expected. "Are you asking me to stay away from him?" "I'm asking you," Kael said, "to be careful, which from what I've seen, might be the hardest thing I could ask you to do." She almost didn't tell him. She'd built the lie carefully enough in her head that walking away would have been easy, plausible, defensible, the kind of half-truth that had kept her alive for a decade. But Kael was still watching her, steady and waiting, and something about the way he'd just handed her his own fracturing trust in Marcus, without flinching, made the lie feel suddenly, unbearably small. "There's something you should know," she said, before she could talk herself out of it. He went very still. "About Marcus?" "About me." Her heart was hammering now, loud enough she was certain he could hear it, certain that particular vulnerability was one more thing his enhanced senses could read straight off her skin. "I wasn't just on that train by accident. I was sent." The room seemed to shrink around the words. "Sent by whom?" "I can't tell you that yet." She held his gaze, made herself hold it because looking away now would read as exactly the kind of confirmation she couldn't afford. "But I was asked to gather information about your pack, about you." A breath unsteady. "I haven't sent anything back. Not one word. I want you to know that first, before anything else." Kael's expression didn't move for a long, terrible moment. No flare of anger, no flash of the fury she'd half expected. Just a stillness so total, it felt louder than any shout could have been. She'd seen this kind of quiet before, in men far more dangerous than she wanted to admit he might be, and every instinct in her went taut, waiting. "You're a spy," he said finally, flat, testing the word out like it didn't quite fit. "I was." The past tense came out before she decided to use it, and she heard herself say it and understood, with a jolt, that she meant it. "I don't know what I am right now. Everything I was supposed to be sure of stopped being simple the second you bit me on that train." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you just handed me your own doubts about a man who saved your life twice, without knowing if I'd use it against you." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last of it. "Because I'm so tired of being the only person in every room who's lying." Silence stretched between them, thick enough to touch, and Clara stood inside it with her pulse hammering in her hands, for once perfectly still, not from control this time. From the strange, terrifying calm of having finally put something true into the world, and having nowhere left to hide from what came next. "Not for whom," Kael said finally, low, each word deliberate. "You said you can't tell me who sent you. Tell me why, instead. What they wanted from this." "Leverage," she said. "Something they could use against you. Against your pack." She swallowed. "I don't know exactly what shape that was supposed to take. I was never given the whole picture. That's how they work. Everyone gets exactly enough to be useful, and not one thing more." His eyes hadn't left hers once through any of it, gold-flecked and unreadable, weighing something she couldn't name. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter, rougher than before. "You could have kept lying," he said. "You're good at it. I wouldn't have known." "I know. Then why stop?" Clara opened her mouth to answer, and found for the first time in longer than she could remember that she didn't have a strategic response prepared. Just the truth, raw and unpolished, sitting there instead. "Because I didn't want to be someone who lied to you anymore," she said. "Even if it cost me everything." He didn't yell. He didn't threaten her, didn't call for guards, didn't do any of the things her training had quietly braced her for the moment the confession left her mouth. He just went quiet, and the quiet was worse. Kael excused himself not long after. Some pack matter, he said, though she recognized a retreat when she saw one, having orchestrated enough of them herself over the years. She spent the rest of that day watching, without meaning to, for signs of him, and finding fewer of them than she expected. No study visits, no terrace walks. When their paths did cross in a hallway near evening, his eyes met hers for exactly as long as courtesy required, and no longer. By the second day, The pattern had solidified into something she couldn't pretend not to notice. 2 guards now stationed, discreetly but unmistakably, closer to her door than they'd been before. A careful, professional distance in every interaction, the kind Kael himself had once used on her in the study their first night, before any of this had softened into something else. He wasn't punishing her. She understood that much, clearly enough. Nothing he did constituted cruelty. Nothing crossed into the kind of retaliation she'd half expected, and almost, in some perverse way, would have found easier to withstand. He was simply pulling back, protecting himself, the only way a man like him seemed to know how, brick by careful brick, the exact architecture she'd spent her whole life building for herself. It should have been a relief. A wall like that, put back up between them, was exactly the kind of distance that made her job simpler, made the ache in her chest easier to file away as an inconvenience rather than something that mattered. It wasn't a relief. It was the opposite, sharp and unfamiliar, an ache that had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with the particular hollow absence of his attention after 4 days of having it constantly. She caught herself standing outside the study door that evening, hand raised to knock, before she made herself lower it and walk away instead. She had no right to his trust back on command. She'd spent it deliberately with her own confession, and now she had to live inside the cost of that, the same way she'd have lived inside any other calculated risk. Except this one didn't feel calculated anymore. This one felt like grief. She was still standing in the hallway, arguing with herself, when her phone buzzed one final time. Sharp, insistent, cutting through the ache like a blade through fabric. She pulled it out with hands that had gone cold. Handler. This is the last message you'll get from me. 24 hours. Deliver what we asked, or your brother dies tonight at the end of that window. No further extensions, no further warnings. Clara read it twice, then a third time, willing the words to rearrange themselves into something survivable. They didn't. 24 hours. Not 3 days. Not enough time to build the careful, patient plan she'd been quietly assembling since the moment Marcus had said her brother's name in that corridor. She looked up from the screen, toward the closed study door, toward the man on the other side of it, who had pulled away from her at the exact moment she needed him most, and understood with cold and total clarity that whatever pride had kept her from knocking a moment ago no longer mattered at all. She raised her hand and knocked. The door opened before her knuckles finished the second knock. Kael stood in the frame, sleeves pushed back, the careful distance of the last 2 days still visible in the set of his shoulders, but his eyes found her face fast, alert, already reading the wreckage he must have sensed in her before she'd said a single word. Clara. Just her name, low, a question folded inside it. 24 hours, she said, and her voice cracked on the second word, despite every effort to keep it steady. That's what I have left. After that, they kill him. She hadn't meant to say it like that, raw, unguarded, none of the careful framing she'd have used a week ago. But 2 days of silence between them had worn something loose in her, and there was no more time left to be careful with it. Kael didn't ask who him was. She watched understanding land in his face instead, fast and total, the same recalibration she'd seen from him twice before. Come in, he said, and stepped back to let her pass. She told him everything then, not the careful, compartmentalized version she'd offered 2 days ago, but the whole shape of it. Her brother, the embezzlement, the syndicate's rules about second chances, and the particular cruelty of people who called murder an example instead of what it actually was. She told him about the handler, the burner phone, the ledgers she'd built for 2 masters at once, and the message sitting on her screen right now with a clock running inside it. He listened without interrupting, arms crossed, jaw tight, and when she finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. 24 hours isn't enough time to plan anything careful, he said. No. Which means we do this fast, or we don't do it at all. We. The word landed somewhere she hadn't braced for, warm and startling in the middle of all that fear. I wasn't asking you to fix this, she said, though some smaller, more honest part of her understood, even as she said it, that some piece of her had been hoping exactly that. I know. His eyes held hers, steady despite the tension radiating through every line of him. I'm offering anyway. She thought of 10 years spent building walls, precisely so she'd never have to hear an offer like that and believe it. She thought of her brother's voice on that first call, thin and terrified, and understood that whatever pride she had left didn't matter anymore, not against a clock counting down toward his death. "Okay," she said. "Together then." Something eased in his shoulders, small but real, the first genuine relief she'd seen on him since the confession 2 days ago. "I have resources you don't," he said. "Money that isn't easily traced. People who can move fast and quiet. If your handler's operation has a physical presence anywhere near here, we can find it faster than you could alone. And if it doesn't work, if they see us coming, then we make sure they don't see us coming." His jaw set, something harder moving behind his eyes now, an edge she hadn't seen from him before. "I've spent 6 years learning how to protect what's mine, without anyone realizing they should have been afraid of me until it was already too late." Clara studied him, the shift from careful diplomat to something colder, more dangerous, mobilizing in real time behind a face she was only now starting to fully understand. She'd spent her whole life relying on no one but herself. She had exactly no experience trusting a plan she hadn't built entirely alone. She was going to have to learn fast. "Then let's start," she said. "I have a financial trail I've been quietly pulling for days. I think it leads somewhere neither of us is going to like." They worked through the night, spread across the study's long table. Laptops and paper ledgers mixed together in a chaos that somehow made sense to both of them. Clara traced the shell accounts she'd flagged from the shipment discrepancy, cross-referencing routing numbers against patterns she recognized from a decade of watching the syndicate move money without leaving fingerprints. Kael worked a different angle, pack contacts, quiet questions sent out through channels Marcus wouldn't think to monitor, the kind of information that came from loyalty rather than paperwork. By 3 a.m., the two trails collided. "This account," Clara said, turning her laptop so he could see the screen, voice gone very quiet. "It's structured exactly like the syndicate's laundering signature. Same split pattern, same threshold avoidance. I've seen this exact fingerprint before, on money that funded operations meant to look like they came from nowhere." Kael leaned closer, studying the numbers, and she watched his jaw go tight as the pieces assembled themselves in front of him. "That account routes through a holding company Marcus set up 2 years ago," he said, low, "officially for pack investment purposes. I signed off on it myself." The room went very still. 2 years, Clara repeated. "That's not a recent betrayal. That's not opportunism. That's a long game." Kael's voice had gone flat, cold in a way she hadn't heard from him yet, the sound of a man watching a friendship rearrange itself into something unrecognizable in real time. "He's been building this for years, which means whatever your syndicate wanted from you, whatever they're threatening your brother over." "It might not be a coincidence," Clara finished, the realization landing like a stone dropping through her chest. "If Marcus has ties to my syndicate, then my brother's debt, my assignment, the train, none of it might be random at all." She thought of the corridor 2 days ago, Marcus's easy smile, the casual mention of her brother that had chilled her to the bone. Careful people usually have something worth being careful about. At the time she'd read it as a threat born of proximity, a dangerous man capitalizing on information he'd stumbled across. Now it read like something else entirely. Recognition, maybe. 2 pieces of the same operation, meeting in a hallway and pretending not to know each other. "He knew who I was before I told anyone," she said slowly, "that first week. He knew about my brother before I'd said a word to you about him existing." Kael's hands flattened against the table, knuckles white. "You think he's the reason you were sent here at all?" "I think," Clara said, "that I need to find out exactly how deep this goes before either of us moves against him. Then any move we make gets reported straight back to the people holding my brother's life over my head." The weight of that settled between them, heavy and cold. Whatever plan they built now had to account for a traitor with eyes inside both operations, watching for exactly this kind of counterattack. A floorboard creaked somewhere down the hall, faint enough that Clara might have missed it a week ago. Now every nerve in her body went taut, instantly alert. Kael's head turned toward the sound too, expression sharpening into something predatory and focused. "That's not a pack member on rotation," he said quietly. "Wrong gate. Too careful." Clara was already reaching for the blade she kept in her boot, pulse hammering, every professional instinct she owned screaming the same warning at once. The attack came from the window, not the door. Clara barely registered the shattering glass before instinct took over completely, throwing herself sideways off the chair as a figure surged through the broken frame, blade already swinging toward the space where her throat had been a half-second earlier. She hit the floor hard, rolled, came up with her own knife already in her hand, 10 years of training taking over where thought left off. The attacker was fast, professional, the kind of controlled violence that told her immediately this wasn't some opportunistic pack rival. This was someone sent, someone paid. She blocked the second strike on pure reflex, steel ringing against steel, and felt the impact shudder up through her wrist hard enough to numb it. Her attacker was stronger than her, faster too, and for one terrible, clarifying second, she understood she was going to lose this fight on raw physical terms alone. Then Kael moved. She barely saw it happen, a blur of motion, a sound low and terrible that didn't belong to anything human. And suddenly the attacker was airborne, slamming into the far wall hard enough to crack plaster. Kael stood over him a heartbeat later, something feral and controlled at once burning behind his eyes, close enough to violence that Clara felt her own pulse spike at the sight of it. The fight that followed lasted seconds, brutal and economical, Kael's movements carrying a precision that told her exactly how many times he'd done this before, and exactly how little he enjoyed it. When it ended, the attacker lay unconscious against the wall, and Kael straightened slowly, breathing hard, blood, not his, dark against his knuckles. Clara. His voice came out rough, urgent, already crossing the space between them. Are you hurt? No. Her own voice sounded strange to her, thin with adrenaline. No, I'm fine. He reached her in 2 strides, hands framing her face with a gentleness that felt almost violent in its contrast to what she'd just watched him do. Checking her over with an intensity that had nothing to do with doubt and everything to do with fear. You're not fine, he said. You're shaking. She hadn't noticed. She noticed now, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline finally catching up to what had almost happened. Who trained you to fight like that? She said instead, staring at him, at the blood on his hands, at the barely leashed danger still radiating off him like heat off pavement. That wasn't just an alpha's strength, that was technique. Something flickered behind his eyes, old pain, old necessity, a story he clearly hadn't planned on telling tonight. Someone I trusted, a long time ago, taught me that strength alone gets you killed by someone patient enough to wait you out. His jaw tightened. I promised myself I'd never be that unprepared again. Clara looked down at the unconscious man against the wall, at the professional precision of the attack that had nearly ended her, and understood with cold certainty exactly who had sent him. He knows we're onto him, she said. This wasn't random. This was Marcus, making sure I don't live long enough to prove it. Kael's expression hardened into something absolute. Then he's already declared war. He just didn't expect us to survive the opening move. He helped her to her feet, hands steady now despite the blood still on them, and for a moment they simply stood there in the wreckage of the broken window, adrenaline and fear and something else entirely tangled together between them. I need to know everything, Kael said quietly. All of it. No more half-truths, no more compartments. If we're doing this, we do it as partners, or we don't do it at all. Clara looked at him, really looked, past the blood and the danger and the careful control he'd spent days rebuilding around himself. And felt the last of her walls, the ones she'd spent a lifetime constructing, finally, completely give way. Okay, she said. They moved to the study once the wreckage of the attack had been cleared, guards posted at every entrance now, and Clara sat across from Kael with nothing left to hide behind at all. My name isn't just Clara, she started, and made herself keep going even as every trained instinct screamed at her to stop. It's the name I've used the longest, but it's not the one I was born with. I stopped answering to that one a long time ago. She told him about her handlers, the ones who'd raised her more than her actual parents had, who'd taught her that love was a lever and trust was a weakness dressed up as comfort. She told him about the years of work that followed, quiet and unglamorous, moving through other people's lives like smoke, never staying long enough to be caught or cared about. She told him about her brother, the only person in the world she'd never learned to keep at arm's length, the one soft place in an otherwise armored life, and the phone call that had shattered everything 4 days before a train ride changed the rest of it. The syndicate doesn't forgive debts, she said. They make examples. My brother skimmed money he had no right to touch, and the only leverage I had to protect him was my own usefulness, information, access, whatever they needed, wherever they needed it. Her voice caught, briefly, before she forced it steady again. They sent me to gather intelligence on your pack because someone told them it was worth the risk. Marcus, Kael said, Flat. I think so. I can't prove the connection goes back that far, not yet. But it fits too well not to be true. Kael was quiet for a long moment, processing, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of the anger she might have braced for 2 days ago. Just a low, steady resolve that settled something anxious in her chest. You came here as a weapon aimed at me, he said, and instead you handed me the first real proof I've had that someone I trusted for 6 years has been lying to me the entire time. A pause. That's not the story of a spy completing her mission, Clara. That's the story of someone who chose differently. I didn't choose it easily. No, something almost gentle moved behind his eyes. But you chose it anyway. That matters more than you think it does. She felt something loosen in her chest, warm and unfamiliar, the particular relief of having told the whole truth to someone and watching them stay instead of walking away. It was a feeling she hadn't built any defenses against because she'd never expected to need them. We have less than a day, she said, pulling herself back to the clock still running somewhere behind all of this. My brother, Marcus, whatever this syndicate actually wants, all of it collides in less than 24 hours now, and I don't have a clean plan for surviving it yet. Then we build one, closing his hand over hers, steady and certain in a way that settled the tremor still lingering in her fingers. Together, no more secrets between us, no more compartments. Clara looked down at his hand over hers, at the blood still faintly staining his knuckles, at the wreckage of the window still visible through the study door, and understood that whatever she'd been before the train, careful, isolated, unreachable, she wasn't that woman anymore. Couldn't be, even if she wanted to. Together, she said, and meant it completely for the first time in her life. Then we end this, Kael said, low and certain. Together. For the first time since a stranger's teeth had changed everything on a midnight train, the word didn't sound like a cage at all. It sounded like the only thing standing between her and losing everyone she had left. The message arrived at dawn, and it broke something in her that 4 days of danger hadn't managed to touch. Clara's phone buzzed against the study table where she'd left it, and she almost didn't look at it right away. Too absorbed in the plan she and Kael had spent the night building, contingencies stacked against contingencies, the closest thing to hope she'd let herself feel since the train. Then the sound repeated, insistent, and something in the rhythm of it made her stomach drop before she'd even read the screen. A photo loaded first. Her brother, bound to a chair in a room she didn't recognize, a bruise already blooming along his jaw, eyes wide and terrified in a way that hollowed her out completely. The message beneath it was short. Unknown number, hand over the alpha, alone, unarmed, by midnight, or we send the next photo one piece at a time. The room tilted. Clara heard herself make a sound she didn't recognize, something between a gasp and a sob, and felt Kael's hand close around her shoulder before she'd even registered him crossing the room. Clara, look at me. His voice cut through the ringing in her ears, low and urgent. What happened? She turned the phone toward him with hands that had gone numb, and watched his expression shift from concern to something colder, harder, as he read the message. They have him, she said, and her voice cracked completely on the last word. They took him, before we could even... She stopped, breath catching, the careful architecture of every plan they'd built overnight, collapsing in on itself at once. This is my fault. All of this is my fault. It's not your fault. I built a career out of controlling every variable. Her voice rose, sharp with panic she couldn't fully contain anymore. I was so careful, and it still wasn't enough. And now they're going to hurt him because of choices I made. Kael's hands found her face, steady, grounding, forcing her to hold his gaze even as everything in her wanted to fall apart completely. Listen to me. Whoever did this planned it long before you ever fell asleep on that train. You didn't cause this. You've just been the one paying for it. She wanted to believe him. Some small exhausted part of her almost did. But the photo was still there, burned into her vision, her brother's terrified eyes, the bruise, the room she didn't recognize, and no amount of reassurance could unmake the fact that his life was now measured in hours because of the exact leverage the syndicate had always known how to use against her. They want you, she said, forcing herself back into something functional, something that could think instead of only feel. Alone. Unarmed. That's not a ransom demand, Kael. That's an execution dressed up as a trade. I know. If I hand you over, You're not handing me over. We're not doing this on their terms. Not blind, not alone, not without a plan that gives your brother an actual chance of walking out of this alive. Clara looked down at the photo one more time, at the fear in her brother's eyes, and felt the full weight of everything she'd tried to protect, finally, catastrophically, slipping through her fingers, despite every careful thing she'd done to hold on to it. For the first time since the train, she had absolutely no idea what came next. She waited until Kael left the room to coordinate with his people before she let the old instinct take over completely. It came back easily, terrifyingly easily, like slipping into a coat she'd never really taken off. Handle it alone. Tell no one. Trust nothing but your own hands. 10 years of training didn't disappear just because 4 days with a claiming mark had made her feel briefly like she might be allowed to lean on someone else. She pulled up a map of the city on her laptop, cross-referencing the photo's background details against locations she remembered from her handler's old briefings. A warehouse district near the docks, industrial and forgettable. Exactly the kind of place a syndicate used when they wanted privacy and no witnesses. She found 3 possible matches within 20 minutes. Old habits, at least, hadn't gotten slower. If she went alone, she reasoned, she controlled every variable again. No pack politics, no risk of Kael walking into an ambush that killed him along with her brother. No collateral damage beyond herself, which was, in the end, the only currency she'd ever really been willing to spend. She was halfway to the door, jacket already on, blade already secured against her calf, when Kael's voice stopped her cold from the doorway. Don't. She turned and found him watching her with an expression that held none of the surprise she might have expected, just tired, certain knowledge, like he'd read the entire plan off her before she'd even finished forming it. You already know what I'm about to say, she said quietly. I know exactly what you're about to say. You're going to tell me this is your fight, your brother, your mess to clean up. You're going to tell me it's safer if you go alone. His jaw tightened. You're going to be wrong on every count. I've done this before. Her voice came out sharper than she meant, defensive in a way that surprised even her. I know how to move through hostile territory without being seen. I know how to negotiate with people who don't value human life the way you do. This is what I was trained for, Kael. Let me do the one thing I actually know how to do. And if it's a trap built specifically around your training? He stepped closer, and there was nothing gentle in his voice now, just hard, unflinching honesty. They know you, Clara. They raised you in the ways that matter. Do you really believe your handler doesn't know exactly how you try to solve this alone? The words landed like a blow, because some cold, honest part of her recognized the truth in them immediately. Of course they'd know. They'd trained her to be exactly this predictable, in exactly this kind of crisis. The isolated operative, sacrificing herself cleanly, rather than risking anyone else. It wasn't a flaw in the plan. It was the plan. Then what do you suggest? She said, quieter now, some of the fight draining out of her. Because I can't just sit here while they hurt him. We go together. On our terms, not theirs. Kael's hand found her shoulder, steady, grounding the way it had that morning, over the photo. You said it yourself. You're tired of being the only one lying, the only one carrying everything alone. This is the same lesson, Clara. You don't have to prove you can survive this by yourself. You just have to let someone stand beside you while you do it. Clara stood very still, jacket still half-zipped, blade still strapped against her calf, and felt the old architecture of her entire life groaning under the weight of a truth she wasn't ready to fully accept. I don't know how to do that, she admitted finally, voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to let someone else carry part of this. Then let me teach you, Kael said. The same way you've been teaching me, this whole time, how to trust someone I only met 5 days ago. They ended up on the same terrace where she'd almost once let herself fall completely. Except tonight, there was no pretense of a quiet evening. Just 2 people standing in the dark, with a clock they couldn't stop counting down behind them. I need to tell you something, Clara said, staring out at the tree line, instead of at him, because some things were easier said without the added weight of his eyes on her face. About why this is so hard for me, letting you in like this. You don't owe me an explanation. I know. I want to give you one anyway. She took a breath, unsteady. My handlers raised me from the time I was young enough not to remember anything different. And the first real lesson they taught me, before anything about tradecraft, before anything about survival, was that needing someone else was the fastest way to get destroyed. Love, attachment, trust. All of it was leverage, dressed up to look like comfort. They made sure I understood that, before I was old enough to argue. Kael was quiet, listening, the same careful stillness he'd offered her since the very first night in the study. So I stopped meeting anyone, she went on. Not gradually, all at once, as a kind of survival skill, the same way you'd learn to hold your breath underwater. And it worked, for 10 years, right up until a stranger's teeth put a mark on my shoulder that apparently doesn't care what lessons I learned as a child. And now, Kael said quietly, needing someone feels like the most dangerous thing you've ever done. Yes, the word came out cracked, raw. Because if I let myself need you, really need you, not just tactically rely on your resources, then you become the exact kind of leverage they always warned me about. And I don't know how to survive that kind of exposure. I've never had to. Kael turned to face her fully, and in the low light of the terrace, his expression had none of the careful control she'd grown used to. Just something open, unguarded, matching the rawness in her own voice. I understand more of that than you probably think, he said. I told you once, someone taught me that strength alone gets you killed by someone patient enough to wait you out. He paused, jaw tightening around a memory she hadn't asked to hear yet. That someone was my father. He led this pack before me, and he trusted the wrong beta the same way I trusted Marcus. It cost him his life, and it cost me 6 years of deciding that control was the only thing standing between me and the same mistake. You never told me that. I've never told anyone that. His voice roughened further. I built the same wall you did, Clara. Different bricks, same architecture. And I've spent 5 days watching you tear pieces of mine down, without even trying. And I don't know how to feel about that, except terrified and grateful at the same time. Fragile and enormous. And Clara felt something in her chest crack open completely. Not the frightened unraveling she'd expected, but something closer to relief. The particular relief of discovering she wasn't the only one standing on the edge of this kind of exposure. I'm afraid, she said simply, of losing my brother tonight. Of losing you, somehow, in whatever comes next. Of finding out that needing you was exactly the mistake they always warned me it would be. I can't promise you it won't cost you something, Kael said, low and honest. I can promise you that you won't carry it alone. Not tonight. Not after tonight either, if you'll let me stay standing where I am. Clara reached for his hand in the dark. And for the first time since the mark had seared into her shoulder 5 days ago, the contact didn't feel like a claim being pressed onto her. It felt like a choice she was finally, fully making herself. By the time they returned to the study, something between them had shifted permanently, and Clara found she worked differently because of it, sharper somehow, with less of herself held in reserve. Marcus thinks your power is only physical, Kael said, spreading a rough map of the warehouse district across the table. That's his mistake. He's built his whole plan assuming I'll come alone, angry, thinking with instinct instead of strategy. He doesn't know you're going to be the reason that doesn't happen. Walk me through what you've got, Clara said, already leaning over the map, the old professional focus settling over her like armor she'd finally chosen to wear on purpose, instead of out of necessity. He laid it out. Pack members he trusted absolutely, positioned quietly around the district's perimeter over the past hour. Communication routes that didn't run through any channel Marcus could intercept. Resources deep enough to fund a rescue operation without leaving a financial trail for the syndicate to trace back to its source. Clara matched it with everything she knew, the warehouse's likely layout, based on 3 similar properties she'd studied over the years. The syndicate's standard security patterns, predictable in ways they'd never bothered fixing because no one had ever lived long enough to exploit them. The precise narrow window in every hostage exchange, where control briefly, fatally slipped from the captors to whoever was fast enough to seize it. If they're expecting you alone and unarmed, she said, tracing a possible entry point on the map, then the moment they realize you're not, that's our opening. Confusion, even for a few seconds, is worth more than force in a situation like this. You'll need to be close enough to reach your brother the second that opening happens. I will be. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, the particular calm of a plan finally taking shape instead of collapsing under her. I've spent my whole life learning how to move through exactly this kind of chaos. Let me do what I'm actually good at. Kael studied her for a long moment, something proud and worried tangled together behind his eyes. I trust you completely. That terrifies me almost as much as it settles me. Good, Clara said. Then we're both terrified together. That's new for me too. They finished the plan as the last hour before midnight bled away outside the windows, both of them moving with the kind of quiet, focused efficiency that came from two very different kinds of competence, finally working in the same direction instead of against each other. When it was done, Kael reached across the table one last time and closed his hand over hers. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, "you don't walk into that warehouse as someone's hostage or someone's weapon. You walk in as exactly who you are. That's the only version of you I want standing beside me." Clara looked down at their joined hands, at the plans spread across the table between them, at the clock ticking down toward a confrontation that would either save everything she had left or cost her all of it at once. "Then let's go get my brother back," she said. Somewhere outside, the city's midnight bells began to toll, low and steady, counting down the final hour before everything came due. The warehouse district looked exactly like the photo's background had suggested. Flat, industrial, forgettable in the specific way that meant no one had asked questions about the trucks that came and went at odd hours. Clara sat low in the back of an unmarked van 3 blocks out, earpiece cold against her skin, watching the last pieces of Kael's plan click into place, through a tablet relaying feeds from pack members already stationed around the perimeter. 6 positions, she counted. 6 sets of eyes that Marcus's people had no reason yet to suspect existed. "Priya's confirmed the north exit," came a voice through her earpiece, clipped and steady. "No additional guards moved in the last hour. Whoever's running this thinks the ultimatum did its job." "Good," Kael said beside her, voice low, all the careful diplomat burned away into something focused and lethal. "Then they're still operating on the assumption I'm coming alone and unarmed." Clara studied the tablet's feed, cross-referencing it against everything she'd pulled in the last 2 hours. Financial records she'd finally cracked open wide enough to trace clean back to a syndicate account she recognized instantly. One she'd handled paperwork for herself years ago, without ever knowing whose signature actually sat behind it. "I found something," she said quietly, "while you were briefing the perimeter team." Kael's eyes cut to her, sharp. "Tell me." "The account funding tonight's operation, the one paying for the warehouse, the men holding my brother, traces back through 4 shells, but the 4th one isn't syndicate-owned property. It's registered to a holding company." She swallowed hard. "The same holding company Marcus set up 2 years ago, the one you signed off on." The silence in the van went absolute. "Say that again," Kael said, voice gone very quiet. "It's not just that Marcus is connected to the syndicate," Clara said, forcing the words out even as her own mind recoiled from the shape of what she was about to say. "It's that tonight's entire operation, the kidnapping, the ultimatum, all of it, is being funded through his accounts, not the syndicate's independent resources. His." She watched the realization land in Kael's face, watched something in him go cold and still in a way she recognized now as far more dangerous than anger. "He's not just corrupted," Kael said slowly. "He's running this. All of it." "I think so," her voice cracked slightly on the admission, "which means my brother was never just unlucky. If Marcus's fingerprints go back 2 years, and my brother's debt only started 8 months ago." She stopped, the full shape of the thought too enormous to finish out loud yet, though she could already feel it taking form, cold and inevitable, somewhere beneath the fear. Kael reached over and closed his hand around hers, and for a moment, steady despite the fury she could feel radiating off him in waves. "Whatever this turns out to be," he said, "we finish it tonight, together, like we planned. Nothing changes except how much I want to be the one who ends him personally." Clara nodded, throat too tight for words, and looked back down at the tablet, at the 6 quiet positions, ringing a warehouse that held her brother's life inside it. "Positions confirmed," Priya's voice came through the earpiece again. "We're ready when you are." Kael looked at Clara one last time, something unspoken passing between them. Not quite a question, more a final check that she was steady enough for what came next. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. "Then let's go get your brother," Kael said, and opened the van door into the dark. They didn't move on the warehouse directly. Not yet. Kael's plan called for one final piece first, a source inside Marcus's own operation, a low-level courier Priya had quietly identified and turned over the last several hours, with money and the promise of protection once this was over. Clara crouched beside Kael in the shadow of a loading dock 2 buildings over, watching the man's hands shake as he laid out in a fast and frightened whisper everything he knew. "It wasn't ever really about the money your brother skimmed," the courier said, eyes darting between them, like he expected Marcus to materialize out of the dark and punish him for talking at all. That was just the opening. Marcus has had people watching your brother's crew for almost 2 years, waiting for exactly this kind of mistake. Clara's stomach dropped. Watch him for what? For someone connected to the syndicate who had a reason to be useful to the pack, the courier said. Someone the syndicate could send in close, without raising suspicion. Marcus needed a way to get eyes and hands inside Kael's operation that wouldn't trace back to him directly. His eyes flicked to Clara, apologetic in a way that made the words land even harder. Your brother wasn't unlucky. He was chosen. Small enough debt to control, connected enough to you, that the syndicate already had you catalogued as an asset worth cultivating. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her. You're saying this was engineered, she said slowly, each word costing her something. From the beginning. My brother's mistake wasn't a mistake at all. I don't know all of it, the courier admitted. I just move packages mostly. But I heard enough over the years to know Marcus doesn't do anything without a purpose behind it. He's been building towards something bigger than skimmed money for a long time. This, he gestured vaguely toward the warehouse, toward the entire situation swallowing her whole. This was never really about your brother. He was just the door Marcus needed to walk you through. Clara sat back on her heels, the full sickening shape of it finally assembling itself completely. Every carefully engineered piece, her brother's debt, her own assignment, the train that ran, conveniently, straight through Kael's territory at exactly the hour it did. None of it had been chance. Marcus had built this architecture patiently, over years, and she had walked directly into the center of it, believing herself to be the one running the operation. He used my brother as bait, she said, voice hollow, for 2 years, just to get someone inside your pack he could eventually leverage into something bigger. Beside her, Kael had gone rigid, fury radiating off him in waves that made the courier flinch back instinctively. What's the bigger plan, he said, low and dangerous. What was he actually building toward? I don't know exactly, the courier admitted again, smaller now. But I heard him talk about the pack's territory rights, old treaties, something about how much easier it'd be to renegotiate everything if the current alpha was discredited, removed. Clara looked at Kael, watched the final piece land in his expression. Not just betrayal now, but the full, cold scope of a plan that had been quietly dismantling his life's work for years while he trusted the man doing it. He was never going to stop at money, Kael said quietly. He was building toward taking everything. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance, Clara said, and felt something steady settle over the fury and grief both. The particular calm she'd learned a long time ago to summon exactly when it mattered most. My brother is still in there. Whatever Marcus's bigger plan is, it doesn't matter until we get him out. Kael nodded once, sharp, and looked toward the warehouse's dark silhouette with an expression that promised Marcus was about to discover exactly how badly he'd underestimated both of them. Then let's finish this, he said. The extraction started at the north exit, exactly where Priya had confirmed the weakest coverage. And Clara moved through the dark with a focus so total, it burned away every trace of fear she'd carried into the district. 2 guards, northeast corner, she murmured into her earpiece, counting silhouettes through a gap in the fence line. Neither's looking this direction. We have maybe 90 seconds before the rotation shifts. Copy. Kael's voice came back low. Priya's team is moving on the south side now. That's our diversion. A crash sounded somewhere across the compound seconds later. Controlled, deliberate, exactly loud enough to draw attention without triggering full alarm. Clara watched both guards' heads turn toward the sound, and moved. She was over the fence and across open ground before either of them fully registered the movement, blade already in hand, years of training carrying her low and silent between shipping containers toward the warehouse's side entrance. Kael moved parallel to her, faster than she was, close enough that she felt oddly, fiercely certain nothing in the dark could touch her while he was there. The side door gave way easily, too easily, which should have worried her more than it did, adrenaline narrowing her focus down to a single, driving purpose. Inside, the warehouse opened into a maze of crates and shadow, dim light bleeding from somewhere deeper in. Fan out, Kael murmured, quiet as you can. Clara moved toward the light, pulse hammering, every professional instinct she owned screaming at her to slow down, and every desperate piece of her heart pushing her faster instead. She found the room at the end of a short corridor, a single bare bulb, a chair, her brother slumped in it, bound, bruised, but breathing. Relief hit her so hard, her knees nearly buckled. "Clara." Her brother's voice came out cracked, disbelieving, his head lifting the moment he registered her in the doorway. "You shouldn't have come. It's a trap. They wanted." "I know what they wanted," she said, already moving to him, blade making quick work of the restraints at his wrists. "I'm not leaving you here to find out what happens next." A shout sounded somewhere behind her, sharp and sudden, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle breaking out near the warehouse's main floor. Clara's blood went cold. "They found the diversion," she said into her earpiece, hands still working the last of her brother's restraints loose. "We're covered," Priya's voice cut back, tight with effort. "Get him out, now." Clara hauled her brother to his feet, his weight unsteady against her shoulder, and moved back toward the corridor, with every sense straining for danger. They made it 3 steps before a figure filled the doorway ahead. Not Kael, not one of the pack, a stranger with a weapon already raised. She didn't have time to think, shoving her brother sideways into cover, and closing the distance in a single motion, blade meeting flesh with a precision she hated herself for having, and was grateful for anyway. The man went down. She didn't stop to check if he'd get back up. "Clear," she said, breathless, hauling her brother upright again. "We're moving." They broke into open air minutes later, the cold night hitting her like a physical relief, her brother's arm heavy across her shoulders as she half carried him toward the extraction point. Behind them, the sounds of struggle continued, sharper now, and she caught one glimpse of Kael through the chaos, fast, brutal, utterly in control of violence she still hadn't fully made peace with witnessing. Somewhere in the dark, far off, she heard a voice she recognized instantly, sharp with fury, and the particular shock of a man watching his careful plan collapse in real time. Marcus had realized, finally, exactly how badly he'd been outmaneuvered. Her brother was safe within the hour, tucked into the back of a second vehicle, with a pack medic already checking him over, and Clara allowed herself exactly 90 seconds of relief, before the adrenaline in her chest turned back toward what still had to happen. Kael found her outside the vehicle, knuckles bruised again, expression carved from something hard and absolute. "He's stable," Kael said, glancing toward the van. "Bruised, dehydrated, but stable. He's going to be fine." "Thank you." The words felt too small for what she meant by them, but he seemed to understand anyway, something in his eyes softening briefly, before hardening back into resolve. "Marcus knows we found him out," Kael said. "He's not going to wait for us to come to him a second time. He'll move first, try to consolidate whatever power he can, before the Pack Council learns what he's done." Clara's mind was already turning, the professional calm sliding back over her grief and relief both, sharpening everything into strategy. "Then we don't let him choose the ground, we choose it for him." "What are you thinking?" "He built 2 years of careful architecture around staying hidden," she said. "Financial trails, courier networks, an operation designed to survive scrutiny as long as it stays in the shadows. That's his strength. So we take it away from him, force this into the light, somewhere he can't hide behind deniability or pack politics." Kael's jaw tightened, considering. The council chamber. Neutral ground, witnessed, somewhere his usual leverage, fear, secrecy, whatever hold he has over people, doesn't work the same way. Clara held his gaze, steady despite the exhaustion dragging at every part of her. "You said it yourself. He thinks his power is only physical, and yours too. Let's prove both of us wrong, in front of everyone who matters." Something like pride moved behind Kael's eyes, warm despite the grim circumstances surrounding it. "You're suggesting we summon him, on our terms." "I'm suggesting we make him walk into a room, believing he's still winning," Clara said, "and then take that belief apart, in front of the only people whose opinion he actually needs to survive this." Kael was quiet for a moment, studying her with something that looked unmistakably like awe layered over exhaustion. "A week ago I found a stranger asleep on my shoulder on a train," he said finally. "I don't think I understood yet exactly what kind of weapon I'd claimed." "I'm not a weapon," Clara said, though there was no real heat in it, just tired honesty. "Not anymore. Just someone who's finally decided to use everything I know for something that matters." "Then let's call the council," Kael said, already turning toward the vehicle, purpose settling over him like armor. "And let's make sure Marcus walks into that room with absolutely no idea what's waiting for him." Clara looked back once toward the warehouse district behind them, dark and quiet now, the immediate danger finally, fully behind her for the first time in 5 exhausting days. Ahead of her waited one final confrontation, the one that would decide completely whether everything she'd risked in the last week had been worth the cost. She climbed into the vehicle beside Kael, steady, despite the tremors still faint in her hands, and did not look back again. The council chamber was older than anything else Clara had seen in the compound. Stone walls, a circle of high-backed chairs occupied by pack elders whose faces gave away nothing, and at the center, a bare space meant for exactly this kind of reckoning. She stood just behind Kael's left shoulder, close enough to be present, far enough back to let him hold the room the way 6 years of leadership had taught him to. Her pulse ran steady now, the particular calm she'd learned to summon when the stakes stopped being about fear and started being about precision. Marcus arrived last, exactly as they'd predicted, sauntering into the chamber with the same easy, untouchable confidence he'd worn since the first morning she'd met him. His eyes swept the room, found Clara, and something in his smile sharpened briefly before smoothing back into practiced charm. "An emergency council session," he said, spreading his hands like a man humoring an overreaction. "Should I be flattered?" "Sit down, Marcus," Kael said, voice flat, absolute. Marcus sat, unhurried, and Clara watched him scan the room a second time, more carefully now, some instinct finally catching up to the fact that this gathering didn't have the shape he'd expected. Whatever plan he'd walked in with, she could see him recalibrating it in real time. "I've called this council," Kael said, addressing the elders directly, "to bring forward evidence of a betrayal that's cost this pack more than any of you currently understand." Marcus's expression didn't crack. "Not yet. That's a serious accusation to bring without context." "Then let's give them context," Clara said, stepping forward for the first time, and felt every eye in the room shift toward her at once. She laid it out, the way she'd have laid out any case built over a decade of reading numbers other people didn't want read. Clean, unemotional, devastatingly precise. The shell accounts, the structured payments designed to avoid every reporting threshold. The holding company Marcus had built 2 years ago, and the financial trail connecting it directly to the operation that had kidnapped her brother that same night. "This isn't speculation," she said, sliding a folder of printed documentation across the circle to the nearest elder. "Every account number, every routing pattern, every date lines up." Marcus didn't stumble into corruption. He built it, patiently, over 2 years, using pack resources to fund a syndicate operation aimed directly at destabilizing the leadership sitting in this room. Marcus's composure finally cracked, thin and fast. "This is fabricated. You expect the council to trust the word of an outsider who admitted, herself, to being sent here as a spy?" "I expect the council to trust numbers that don't lie," Clara said, cold and level. "I bought the debt on this, Marcus. I traced every account back to its source myself. You can call it fabrication if you'd like, but the routing numbers on that page match your holding company's registration filings exactly. That's not opinion. That's fact." A murmur moved through the elders, low and sharp, several of them leaning forward over the documentation with expressions that had shifted from skepticism to something far colder. Marcus's eyes cut to Kael, searching for some crack, some hesitation, some sign that 6 years of loyalty might still count for something. He found none. "You're really going to believe her over me," Marcus said, voice tightening for the first time, some of the practiced charm finally slipping away entirely. "After everything I've done for this pack, for you." "I believed you for 6 years, Kael said, quiet, devastating. "I don't anymore." Marcus's gaze swept the chamber one final time, calculating, and Clara watched the exact moment his composure gave way completely. Not to grief, not to remorse, but to something colder and far more dangerous. He was out of room to talk his way free, and men like Marcus, cornered with nothing left to lose, didn't surrender quietly. The chair went over first. Marcus moved fast, faster than she'd expected, faster than the easy, unhurried man she'd watched charm his way through every prior interaction. And Clara barely had time to register the blade in his hand before he lunged, not at Kael, but at her. She threw herself sideways on instinct, the same reflex that had saved her in a study window days earlier. But Marcus had the advantage of surprise this time, and closed the distance faster than she could fully clear it. Pain lanced across her forearm, shallow but sharp, the blade catching skin instead of the vital target he'd aimed for. Then Kael moved, and the room changed entirely. She'd seen him fight before. Controlled, brutal, economical. This was none of that. This was something older, something that tore through 6 years of careful restraint in a single heartbeat, a sound ripping out of him that had nothing human left in it at all. He didn't hold back, didn't calculate, didn't measure the fight the way she'd watched him measure everything since the moment they'd met. He simply became something the elders in that room clearly hadn't seen in years, and every one of them went utterly, reverently silent. Marcus never landed a second strike. Clara watched, breath caught somewhere in her chest, as Kael closed the distance in a blur she couldn't fully track. As Marcus's blade skittered uselessly across stone, as 6 years of buried betrayal finally found its answer in a fight that lasted seconds, and ended with Marcus pinned, broken, and utterly beaten on the chamber floor. Kael stood over him, chest heaving, something feral and protective still burning behind eyes that had gone entirely gold, entirely wolf, and Clara understood, watching him, that he'd made a choice in that half-second she'd never asked him to make. The choice to become something raw and unguarded in front of every elder whose respect he'd spent 6 years carefully cultivating, because her safety had mattered more to him than his own careful image. Kael, her voice came out rough, urgent, cutting through whatever violence still wanted to finish what had started. He's done. It's over. For a moment she wasn't sure he'd heard her at all. Then slowly, the gold in his eyes receded, control easing back over him like a tide pulling back from shore, and he straightened, breathing hard, looking down at Marcus with an expression that held no more anger in it, just cold, absolute finality. "Bind him," Kael said to the guards flooding in behind them, voice steady again despite everything. "He answers to this council for what he's done, not to me alone." Clara pressed a hand to the shallow cut on her arm, adrenaline finally starting to fade enough to let the sting register, and watched Kael turn toward her immediately, all that feral intensity redirected instantly into something gentler, more urgent. "You're hurt," he said, already crossing to her. Barely. She managed something close to a smile, despite the tremors still working through her hands. "You didn't have to do that, turn into whatever that was, in front of everyone." "Yes," Kael said, simply, taking her injured arm with a care that contrasted sharply against the violence she'd just watched him deliver. "I did." Around them, the elders had risen from their seats, murmuring low among themselves, watching Marcus dragged from the chamber floor by guards who no longer looked at him with anything resembling loyalty. The council had seen everything. There was no version of tonight anymore, where anyone in that room doubted who had been right. The formal ruling came before dawn, delivered by the eldest of the council, in a voice that carried the full weight of 6 years of trust collapsing into a single sentence. Marcus was stripped of his standing, effective immediately, Beta no more, cast out from every right and protection the pack had once extended to him. His name entered into record as a warning for whatever pack governed this territory next. Clara watched the ruling land, watched Marcus's face empty of every last trace of charm, leaving behind only the cold, calculating thing he must have been all along, hidden beneath years of careful performance. By mid-morning, word had already spread further. Priya's contacts confirming that without Marcus's leadership, the syndicate's local operation had begun collapsing on itself, associates scattering, accounts freezing, an entire architecture of fear crumbling now that the man holding it together sat in a cell instead of a council seat. Clara's brother, cleared by the pack medic and steadier by the hour, found her on the same terrace where she and Kael had once stood beneath a sky heavy with unfallen rain. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said quietly, still favoring the arm they'd bruised, guilt written plainly across his face. "I got myself into this mess. You shouldn't have had to risk everything to pull me back out." "You're my brother." The words came easier than she expected, uncomplicated in a way very little in her life ever had been. "There was never a version of this where I didn't come for you." He studied her for a long moment, something soft moving behind his eyes. "You seem different," he said finally. "I don't know how to explain it. Steadier, maybe. Like something settled that used to just run all the time, underneath everything you did." Clara thought about that, about the woman she'd been a week ago, cataloging exits before anything else, keeping every door mapped and every person at careful, permanent distance. She thought about the mark still faintly warm beneath her collar, about a terrace conversation that had cracked her open in ways she hadn't recovered from and didn't particularly want to. "I think I finally let someone catch me falling," she said, instead of just teaching myself to fall quietly, alone, every single time. Her brother's gaze shifted, following hers, toward where Kael stood near the terrace doors, giving them privacy, but close enough that she understood, without needing to check, that he'd stay exactly there for as long as she needed him to. "He's the reason," her brother said. "Not quite a question. He's part of it." She smiled, small and real. "The rest is mine. I did that part myself." Her brother pulled her into a hug, careful of her bandaged arm, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the cool morning air, the weight of everything that had happened settling around them. Two people who'd spent most of their lives believing safety was something you built entirely alone, finally allowing themselves to feel something closer to relief. When he finally stepped back, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand and laughing quietly at himself for it, Clara felt the last of the week's fear drain fully out of her chest for the first time since a stranger's teeth had changed everything on a midnight train. It was over, truly finally over. Now came the harder question, what she wanted to build in its place. Kael found her alone on the terrace that evening, the last of the day's light fading gold along the tree line, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. "Your brother settled into the guest wing," he said finally. "Priya's already fond of him. That's rare for her. He has a way of growing on people." Clara let herself smile, easy in a way that still felt new. Slowly, against their better judgment. Silence settled between them again, comfortable this time, nothing frantic left in it. The chaos of the last week had finally, fully drained out of the air, leaving behind something quieter. Something that felt for the first time like the actual shape of her life, rather than a crisis she was surviving through. "What do you want now?" Kael asked. Quiet. No command in it at all. None of the careful ownership she'd once bristled against on a train 5 nights ago. Just a real question, asked by a man who'd clearly spent all day working up to it. Clara considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything that mattered. A week ago, she'd have already been 3 names deep into a new cover, already planning her exit, already treating this entire compound as a temporary shelter to be abandoned the moment it stopped being useful. She didn't want that anymore. She understood that clearly now, standing on this terrace, with the mark on her shoulder, no longer feeling like a claim pressed onto her, but like a choice she'd finally made herself. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because the bond gives me no other option. Because for the first time in my entire life, I actually want to be known. Claimed even, if that's the word for it. Rooted somewhere, instead of always ready to disappear." Something in Kael's expression eased completely. The last of the tension he'd been carrying since the train, finally, fully releasing. "I wasn't looking for this," he admitted, voice rough. "Any of it. A mate, a war with my own beta. A woman who tore down 6 years of careful control in less than a week." He reached for her hand, steady, certain. "But I can't imagine any version of my life now that doesn't have you standing in it. Even though I lied to you, that first week." "Even though." His mouth curved, something warm and unguarded finally allowed to surface fully. "You told me the truth the moment it mattered most. That's worth more than any version of you who never had anything to confess in the first place." Clara stepped closer, closing the last of the distance she'd once so carefully maintained, and felt him meet her halfway without hesitation, without the restraint either of them had needed in the earlier, more careful days of this bond. "The pack will need a Luna," Kael said quietly, against her hair. "If you're staying, if this is real." "It's real," Clara said, "and I think I'd like that. Building something instead of just surviving it." Below them, the compound settled into evening, lights glowing warm against the dark, her brother's laughter drifting faintly up from somewhere near the guest wing, the first real sound of family she'd let herself hear in longer than she could remember. She should have known, she thought one final time, that closing her eyes on a midnight train would cost her everything she'd spent her whole life learning how to protect. She just hadn't known until this exact moment that it would give her back a life worth protecting in its place.